Making the sound. Speaking at a normal volume. Alright, so it looks that is going. Okay. I think we're going on both of these things now. Hello, anybody who might be present on Twitch? Hello, hello. If you're in Twitch and you can give me a sound check, let me know if you can hear me okay. And same over here in Instagram. If somebody doesn't mind letting me know, just, can you hear me all right? Is that coming through? And I'm speaking at a normal volume like this? Wonderful, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm going to give the same caveat I gave last night. I figured out a way to adjust my phone and put it here so it's just out of the line of sight for my camera that's putting me up on Twitch and out of the way of the lights that I've got like here and here. But it's on this long, bendy, wobbly arm. And so anytime I touch it, it just goes it just goes wild like that. It's like a spring. It's so sorry in advance. Especially if I'm scrolling to see comments or something like that, you'll probably see some wobble as if we're all on a ship or something. Hello, hello. If you guys don't mind, drop me a quick comment and just let me know where you're tuning in from and your age if you care to as well. So I have a sense of who is here in the Instagram stream and who is here in the Twitch stream as well. Get started in a couple of minutes, let people roll in. I feel like, oh, I can do that. Got Virginia, 28, 32 from Brazil, 64 next month in New Jersey. Happy early birthday. What I can do. Oh, there we go. Arizona, 46. Argentina, 51. This is what the internet was made for. Ohio, 23. Atlanta, 36. Wonderful. Oh. 25 in the UK. Hey, Jamie. I feel like every time I log in and start clicking around on these things, I'm just blown away. I wish I could share this on Twitch as well. I feel like if they had these little augmented reality things, it would get more people interested in the news if they just had it on CNN or something. Had people clicking around, doing nonsense. So I actually had two, and I'll tell you ahead of time, I guess this time. I had a few people submit questions for this live stream ahead of time that I'm going to answer first, I think. I was trying to cram those all at the end last time around, so I think I'll do them first this time. But if you have any questions about the news in general, a particular news item, something that's happening right now, something you'd like to discuss, hear my opinion or analysis of, something about the news in general, something you just want to bring up because you think it's interesting and you'd like to hear other people's comments, feel free to go ahead and type that in as well, whether you're on Twitch or Instagram. That's interesting stuff to me because I know what I'm interested in and I know what stands out to me, but I also work doing news analysis, so it's something that I do, probably approaching these things in a different way. And I'm always fascinated to see what jumps out at people in terms of stories, but also in terms of just the way things are presented, or things that stand out and seem a little odd, or that don't make sense, or whatever it happens to be. Getting that third-party perspective about the news in some way is useful and interesting to me, and it's something that we can toss around a little bit if you guys are feeling it, if anything pops up. While we're thinking about that, though, I'll go ahead. There was one question that I thought was funny because I think I know exactly what this person's referring to. Opinion on UK politics right now. So I'm far from an expert on UK politics. I don't know if anybody can really call themselves an expert on politics anywhere because there's just so much to politics. But if you haven't been reading up on this and keeping up on this, there's always a collection of scandals happening in all politics everywhere. But right now there's a pretty big one for Prime Minister Boris Johnson in the UK, where, and it's been kind of a slow burn. I strongly suspect there's somebody inside Number 10 who's leaking stuff to the press, because otherwise it wouldn't be coming out at this pace and they wouldn't have as much information and photos and things like they do. But what seems like happened is back in 2020, when the country was under serious lockdown, and they were under lockdown for COVID, and the government was saying it's really important you make these sacrifices so we can get past this wave that's happening and get to a better place by everybody, doing the adult thing and applying some of these restrictions on your life. Hello. And it would seem that at a moment in which basically they were saying no parties, no anything, people weren't able to have funerals for their loved ones who were dying. And in a lot of cases, they weren't able to visit their loved ones as they were dying. And it turns out there was at least one, maybe a couple of parties at Number 10, which is where the Prime Minister lives and works, and where a lot of government happens. When you say Number 10, it's kind of the equivalent of saying the White House here in the U.S. It's saying the government, but it's a literal place as well. And apparently there were some parties, potentially multiple parties, that happened there. And the Prime Minister apparently attended, at least a bit, some of these parties. His excuses, I think, are part of what's digging him deeper. I felt very some significant Bill Clinton scandal vibes with this particular scandal, because it seemed like if he would have come out ahead of it right away and admitted to everything and said, yeah, that was stupid and here's the details, and just then it wouldn't have grown into what it's become. But because he denied and then evidence kept on coming out, he's now in a situation where he's been making kind of these dodgy denials for a while, and now it's clear that he's been at some of these parties. And his excuse is kind of like, oh, I didn't realize there was a party and I happened to step in and then I left to go back to work in the middle of the night because I'm a very good prime minister. Which, I mean, it's made him a laughing stock within Parliament. And yeah, I mean, whatever you think of the guy, he's an interesting character to me because he is so intentionally ruffled seeming. And he apparently has been caught messing up his hair on purpose, because that allows him to kind of seem a little bit scattered and do things in a way that makes it look unintentional, but then he just succeeds at things that you wouldn't think him capable of succeeding at too, which is part of what makes him an effective politician in a moment where there's a bit of chaos, but also something that you can win periodically, which he did with Brexit and which he has with some things related to COVID. But in this moment, it seems like he's in a lot of trouble. I think he had somebody from his party, the Tories, walk over to the other side to work with Labour for the time being, at least, because of these denials and because of his performance and the fact that he apparently went against the government's own guidance, even if only a couple of times, and even if only a little bit. And now he's got some fairly senior people in the Tories as well, telling him flat out, it's time to step down because you're making us look bad. I don't know that they've got enough people yet. I feel like it's something like 15%, but I might be just making that up, of his own party that have to basically come out and say, yes, we want to go through the process of maybe kicking him out. Either that happens or he steps down by choice, I think. So it feels like we're reaching the point where there's got to be a 30, 40, maybe 50% chance that he steps down or gets kicked out sometime in the next couple of weeks. But, and he's been through this type of scandal before, and he is very good at dodging it and very good at pointing at other things. And I feel like all politicians do this to a certain degree, but he's particularly canny when it comes to this type of dodging around and making everybody look at other stuff, other scandals, other things to pay attention to. And maybe it's partially his background writing for newspapers and things, so he knows how the news cycles work. But in any case, UK politics right now are utterly fascinating. Something I didn't know existed until I lived in London for a bit. There's a show called Question Time, where politicians willingly go on television and sit on this stage and they answer questions from the audience. It's something that I can't imagine American politicians or politicians from a lot of other countries subjecting themselves to, but it's indisputably excellent television about half the time. Sometimes it's just incredibly dry and boring, but they almost always have at least one absolutely confident but bumbling idiot who's sometimes a politician and sometimes like a guest. And then they have a whole bunch of very earnest politicians who are trying to one-up each other. And it's just really excellent television if you enjoy the spectacle of politics. And I imagine, I don't know if there's seasons for that, and if anybody in the UK might be able to tell me. I don't know if that's in season, if there are seasons for Question Time, but I imagine if there are, it's got to be phenomenal right now with all of the scandals, whether they're the most important thing we could be paying attention to right now or not. There's a lot of scandals, so I imagine it's very interesting and entertaining. So that's my thought of UK politics. Fortunately, I don't have to worry about them the way that I have to worry about politics here in the here in the US when I'm in the US. But it is something that I get to watch from a distance and just admire for the characters involved and for the unrelenting scandal and comedic value of some of those scandals. Now, all that said, pardon me, losing my voice apparently. See if any other questions popped up here real quick. Look like it. So I will go ahead and get cracking. So here on Twitch and here on Instagram, please feel free to ask, pardon me, ask any questions if they come up, questions about what I'm talking about, questions about the news in general, or things that you've seen in the news, or things that you've just always wanted to know about in the news, related topics to what I'm talking about. If you have any comments on what I'm talking about or want to ask other people who are also tuned in their opinions on these things, that would be very interesting to me as well. But to get started, what I'm going to do is go through today's issue of One Sentence News. And One Sentence News, if you're not familiar, it's a publication I put out each weekday morning where I do one sentence of summary and one sentence of context for 3 different stories in the news. And the stories today come from The Times, from Axios, and from Reuters. The first one, and I'll go through and read the quick summary and context and then add some additional context potentially and take questions on this specifically, then I'll move on to the next one. And you can continue to ask if you want, but that way we can kind of segment up the time and make it a little bit more intelligible. So this one's from the New York Times. Microsoft to acquire Activision Blizzard for $68.7 billion. Microsoft, which owns the Xbox platform and numerous video game world intellectual properties, is planning to acquire Activision Blizzard, the company behind video games like Call of Duty, World of Warcraft, and Candy Crush, for about $68.7 billion. If this deal goes through, and the regulatory environment being what it is, approval is not a sure thing, this will be a bigger purchase than LinkedIn, which Microsoft acquired for $26 billion in 2016. And that, by the way, was their biggest acquisition ever up till this point. And almost as much as Disney paid for Fox back in 2019. The price tag on that deal was $71.3 billion. This acquisition is being pitched by Microsoft's CEO as a fleshing out of their video game studio offerings, which will give them more exclusives to better compete with rival Sony's PlayStation, but also as a portfolio of intellectual property they can leverage throughout theoretical metaverse offerings as new virtual platforms arise. That said, this potential acquisition is happening in the midst of numerous workplace misconduct scandals within Activision Blizzard, and so far about 36 employees have been fired or pushed out of the company for their behavior, and 40 others have been disciplined, all of which could muck up the deal, or at the very least make it more complicated, make it a more complicated public relations gauntlet than it may have otherwise been. Already a good comment here. Oh my god, Call of Duty not going to be free anymore? Yeah, we'll see. Call of Duty, for anybody who's not familiar, is just a stunningly successful video game franchise. And I think they've had paid versions of Call of Duty, but they've got a free version, or some free versions now, because the free model has been so lucrative for so many companies and so many franchises. So it'll be interesting to see what happens here. Some additional context that I actually picked up on this today, after I wrote up those summaries, was that apparently those scandals taking place at Activision Blizzard, which have been substantial and going on for years, but only recently, I think last year, came to the forefront when there were some walkouts by employees. Oh, free versions in Argentina. Okay. Yeah, I think they've got the free versions here too. But apparently those scandals, which some people are saying the CEO should step down and a lot of the higher-ups have been kicked out, that actually reduced the price of Activision Blizzard. And it was in the high 90s, I want to say, per share, and it dropped it down to something like 65 per share. And then Microsoft came in and offered 95 per share. So they were able to get the company cheaper than its price was back before, I want to say in June, but I might be wrong on that. It was somewhere around June of 2021 when all this started to happen, and their stock prices dipped. So when they were still being priced without all of this scandal stuff being priced into their stocks, they're getting it for cheaper than that level. And so Microsoft probably sees it as a pretty good deal as a consequence of that. Activision Blizzard probably sees it as a pretty good deal too, because it's close to what they were valued by the market before all of this HR stuff started happening. And apparently it was just a fairly significant culture of misogyny and harassment and things of that nature. Unfortunately, my understanding is that's pretty common in the video game world. A lot of industries, but the video game world in particular. So they're swooping in, and the idea here is that already Microsoft owns Xbox, which is one of the big two platforms for consoles. You either have a PlayStation or an Xbox, or a Nintendo Switch, I guess. But they are doing well in that regard. They're not as big as Sony, but they've been building out their online platform in a very big way, so that you can stream video games from the cloud rather than necessarily having to have a console. You can do it with a console too, but they're building out their platform that allows you to essentially play games straight on the cloud and just download the graphics as you're playing it, basically. So they're trying to build that out. What this will do is give them exclusives, and some of the biggest, most well-known franchises in the world, like World of Warcraft and Call of Duty, alongside some mobile games like Candy Crush. It'll allow them to put those on their Xbox Cloud platform and to sell them as exclusives for their consoles. But it also gives them the opportunity in the future. And this is what they're talking about with the metaverse play. As there are new games and as there's new virtual reality or augmented reality or new casual versions of those, like Pokemon Go style things where it's sort of augmented reality but kind of casual gaming, they can take all these properties. They can take the orcs from World of Warcraft. They can take characters from Call of Duty. They can take the user interface and gamification concepts of Candy Crush, and they can use that across all these properties. So that means on top of being able to make traditional games, they can make virtual experiences. They can have skins and characters and clothes from all of these things that they can incorporate onto your avatar when you're on a social network that's in the virtual world. They can make, if they wanted to, TV shows and movies, streaming shows, books, whatever they want to make, podcasts out of all of these characters and all of these worlds that they now own, or they could own, the intellectual property for. In order for that to happen, though, this needs to be okayed by regulators. And we're at a point in history right now where we've had so much aggregation in this space and in other spaces where now regulators are starting to look at some of these major companies, especially in the tech world. And Microsoft is one of the big ones in the tech world. They're looking at these companies and saying, oh yeah, they got big. And that's not necessarily a good thing. There's some benefits to that. But it also makes them powerful to the point where they can be abusive. And abusive in the sense of being able to set their prices without having real competition. But also abusive in the sense that some people think Meta, the parent company now of Facebook, in the way that they're sometimes abusive in terms of collecting data or making things very difficult for people using their stuff, because there's not really a valid or equal alternative to a lot of these products from these big companies. So regulators are at a point where they just today approved the potential action, or approved potential action against Meta to maybe break it up. And Meta owns Facebook, they own Instagram, they own WhatsApp, they own Oculus, which is a virtual reality company. They've got some very big companies. And potentially what that could mean is breaking them up so that you have separate companies. And Facebook then would no longer be in the same umbrella company as Instagram and WhatsApp and Oculus, potentially. That would probably be in the distant future because we don't really have historical precedent for breaking up tech companies in this way. That's just not something that happens. But what they might be doing in a context where that's even thinkable is looking at potential acquisitions like this and saying, well, this is something where we might have to break them up in the future if we're not careful. So let's just not let them do the acquisition to begin with. So it may be that they come in and they're like, dude, this is going to be great. We're going to put these companies together. We're going to have all this new stuff. We can make all these games and podcasts and virtual reality experiences and metaverse. But then they won't be able to do it because the regulators will say, nah, that'll be too big. That'll give you too much of a competitive advantage. And you'll be able to then stomp around and boot all of the potential competition that we want to be in this space to ensure that you're not left to your own devices and thus able to abuse your position within the network, or within the industry, rather, on the market. So it's an interesting story, and it's partially interesting, actually. I'm not a huge gamer anymore. I periodically will pick up a game and just work my way through it to see how the games are doing. But back in the day, I didn't play World of Warcraft, but I played the ones that came before that. I played Warcraft and StarCraft, like the strategy games, if anybody played back in the day. Played video games in the 90s and early 2000s. You'll know what I'm talking about. And those defined my childhood to a certain degree. So looking at this company that's already merged, because it was Activision and Blizzard, and then they merged, and then they've bought some other companies to acquire Candy Crush. And now they might merge again with Microsoft, which is essentially taking all of these companies that were super dominant in the 90s and early 2000s and cramming them together into this behemoth. Again, pros and cons to it, because it would be neat in a way for them to be able to leverage all this stuff and put it together in a Netflix-like bundle where you just get all of these games and you get to play all of them whenever you want, which is what they're trying to do. But yeah, it also has the potential to go very sideways, potentially. Yeah, web monopolies, video game monopolies, all different sorts of monopolies. Here. If anybody has any questions here on Twitch or in Instagram, let me know. I'm scrolling through here to see if anything popped up. That's one of the benefits. Twitch definitely isn't made for this type of chat, type of setup, but it is nice that the comments are so easy to see. Whereas here on Instagram, I have to wipe through. What are we talking about? So we just talked about the story of Microsoft trying to acquire Activision Blizzard for not quite $70 billion, which again is just a stunning amount. Their previous biggest purchase ever was when Microsoft bought LinkedIn for $26 billion back in 2016. Oh, asking about traveling. You know, I haven't been to Venezuela, so I don't have any specific advice on that, unfortunately. Sorry. I hear good things, though. I have some friends who are from Venezuela who are really lovely, but I haven't been, and my understanding is that it's still kind of difficult there right now economically, so you'll want to look into that. Cool. So if any questions, if anything comes to mind about that on Twitch or Instagram, please let me know. Just drop a comment. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and move on. This is an interesting story. It's interesting to me anyway because I have very mixed feelings about it. This comes from Axios. DirecTV to remove conservative news network OANN. DirecTV, a satellite TV company co-owned by a private equity firm called TPG and communications company AT&T, has announced it will no longer distribute the far-right One America News Network station after the current contract, which reportedly ends in April of 2022, expires. This is an interesting story because OANN got popular when former President Trump started promoting their shows, and he seemed to promote them because they more or less repeated everything he said unquestioningly, and gave and continued to give special attention to debunked conspiracy theories that he favored. That said, this is also a story about how whole political demographics can have their megaphones taken away by corporate entities that decide to cut them off. This expiring deal with DirecTV, alongside a few other deals with a few other AT&T affiliated networks, reportedly account for about 90% of OANN's total revenue. The reason I have mixed feelings about this is that this station, One American News Network, it was founded, I believe it was 2013. It's relatively new. Most of the big networks were founded back in the 90s, the ones that are still around, the ones that are on TV as well as the web. And this is one of those that's on TV, but it was newer. And they were founded because the guy who made it, AT&T came to him. He has a bunch of other stations. And they said, we need a conservative news network. Can you make us a conservative news network? And so he made them a conservative news network. And they remained kind of just a relatively small conservative news network that was the counterpoint, essentially, to Fox News, which has been around a whole lot longer and already carved out that demographic. They kind of owned it. And AT&T was essentially looking to... It was kind of a business deal where they wanted multiple news networks, but they also wanted to show Fox, hey, if you don't deal with us and deal with us well, we have an alternative, so we don't need you. We will still have another conservative news network, even if we negotiate and can't agree on a price because you want too much. So they were made out of whole cloth to serve a need, to serve a demographic. They got big when Donald Trump started running for office, and they kind of doubled down on his message. They saw that this was a burgeoning demographic with a lot of support, and they said, well, that's interesting. A lot of the news networks are kind of not taking him seriously, but the polls are saying that a lot of people really like him. I'm willing to bet we can take that audience and we can maybe pull them away from Fox News and some of the other existing, like Breitbarts and things like that, these other news networks. We can take some of those away and increase our audience. And so they started to really hit that message hard and inviting him on and then taking his messages and then using that in all of their editorial content. And like a lot of other politically biased, intentionally, by design, news networks, their editorial is blended with their news. And this is why I typically tell people to avoid news networks, TV stations that provide the news because they typically blend things in this way. So you're not necessarily getting straight facts, you're getting very slanted interpretations of what's happening in the world. And this is just one of many news networks that does this. They went really, really hard, though, on some of the conspiracies that the candidate and then President Trump seemed to really enjoy. And that was part of just trying to own that demographic of people who were big fans of the then president. But it's something that made them one of the biggest purveyors of misinformation of all sorts on TV, but then also on the web ultimately. So on one hand, this is a network that is having their money umbilical pulled out, basically. They make about 90% of their total revenue from this deal with AT&T. And AT&T is saying, I believe it's in April, when our deal expires, we're not going to renew. And so they will lose at that point 90% of their revenue, which is just a killing blow, almost certainly. There's a very good chance they can take the brand and move online and probably do okay. But because of all those conspiracy theories that they've been spreading, like just incredibly obviously debunked conspiracy theories, they were kicked off YouTube. They've been kicked off a bunch of other networks because they're spreading a very harmful, in some cases, type of news mysticism. And they're doing it for very cold demographic watching monetary reasons. And these are reasons that it makes sense to follow if you're trying to build a successful news network predicated on a certain audience that wants to hear certain things. So in that way, it makes a whole lot of sense that they would do it in this way. If I was trying to reach that audience, I might do similar things. But this is where the conflict comes in, because on one hand, I'm happy to see a purveyor of misinformation be removed in this way, or to be extracted from the conversation because they're no longer spreading misinformation. But at the same time, it worries me, because what happens to one network, whether or not I like them, can happen to any network. And that means that it could very much happen to news networks that are more legitimate or less heavily biased as well. And I feel like that's something you have to look at anytime something happens to something you don't like or something you consider to be your ideological or otherwise enemy. To say, oh yeah, it feels really great when it happens to somebody I hate, but what if it happened to something I liked or something that I appreciate or find to be valuable? What if it happened to me? I mean, it probably wouldn't happen to any of us individually, but some resource that we have online, if the plug can be pulled so easily on this entity, that means it could also be pulled on some entity that you care about a great deal and that you consider to be very legitimate and that you enjoy and find valuable. That's worrisome to a certain degree. And this is not a free speech issue. This is something where it's a cold-hearted business issue. But it's similar in some ways to the free speech issues, where I think a lot of us instinctually find it very satisfying when the people who vote differently than us or who believe differently from us about whatever, when they are silenced and they are kicked out and their speakers are booted from universities, or they're not allowed to write columns for the newspaper, or they're deplatformed in some way. That's incredibly satisfying. But it's exactly the opposite. And it's inhumane and horrible and a travesty when it happens to somebody that we support. And I feel like working through the dichotomous nature of that type of conversation ahead of time, before it becomes something that just happens constantly, is something that's worth doing. But it's also worth, even if, I don't have any influence on this, so what I think doesn't matter to the suits at TPG and AT&T. They're doing what they're going to do. But I think it helps when we're interpreting and trying to assess our own responses, pieces of news like this, to try to flip the script a bit in that way and interrogate why we feel certain ways, and then try to understand if that is reflective of our actual beliefs. And if so, scaled up, what does that look like? And is it still reflective of our beliefs if this was applied to somebody that we liked rather than somebody that we hated? That's an approach I try to take anyway. And it's something that helps me, I think, avoid falling too far in either direction. Even though I have beliefs, I do try to make sure that I can, rather than strawman other people's beliefs, like you stand up a the weakest possible version of somebody else's argument. I try to steelman other people's beliefs so that when I find something I disagree with, I try to find the best possible version of their argument and stand it up and then try to argue against that. And I find almost always, even though I might still disagree with them, sometimes I change my mind, but even when I still disagree with them, at least then I have a better sense of who these other people are with whom I disagree. And I usually have a sense that they're not evil, horrible people. They're just people who see things differently than I do or come from a different background or whatever. But then it also helps me maybe look at what's happening in the world from a slightly more gray tone rather than the black and white that a lot of the entities that shape our opinions would have us look at the world in. Having things one or the other, good versus bad, that sort of thing. That's seldom appropriate and it's seldom helpful to see things in that way, so I try to avoid it. Let's see here. Checking to see if there's any questions or comments on that. On Instagram and Twitch, please feel free to comment either direction. And in the meantime, I'll go ahead and move on to the third and final story here. And this story, again, published in One Sentence News this morning, comes from Reuters. U.S. households can order 4 free COVID tests starting today. The U.S. government has launched a website through which Americans can order free at-home COVID-19 tests, 4 per household, scheduled to be shipped out about 7 to 12 days after the order is placed. And that website, by the way, if you're in the U.S., is covidtests.gov. This is newsworthy because although the U.S. has had a few pandemic-related victories, especially related to the development and aspects of the distribution of vaccines, I guess probably the manufacturing too, it's been consistently underperforming when it comes to testing, with at-home tests in some cases disappearing from shelves entirely, only available at hospitals or clinics, or in some cases people buying them all up off the shelves and then inflating the prices and selling them online. If this service works, and it did for me yesterday, as the site actually opened up a day early to make sure everything was operating as planned, and if the tests go out at a decent clip, this could help fill in some of the US's current pandemic tracking and treating gaps, though this effort may turn out to be too little too late, as the tests being sent out haven't been great at detecting Omicron, and there's a chance that by the time they start arriving, probably in late January, the current wave will already be subsiding. So that last point is actually a bit of good news. Oh, thank you very much. It's a bit of good news in a way because the overall peak in the US and the UK, actually, I saw a couple of graphs for both today, seem to have been reached. That's in average across these entire countries, though. So like here in Milwaukee, for instance, we haven't hit the peak yet. But in major cities across the US, some larger cities, where the Omicron variant reached faster and spread more rapidly, it seems that they've already started to peak, and that indicates, based on looking at other countries where it spread first, like South Africa, that peak hits, and then you see a couple of weeks later the peak for hospitalizations and deaths, which tend to come later because you get infected and then you have serious consequences if you have serious consequences. So that means that things could be looking pretty good by the end of the month in both the UK and the US, in a lot of places. Not every place, it's not equally distributed, and it might be several weeks after that for some of us. But the downside, for this story at least, is that we have not had, in the US at least, we have not had a good source of tests for COVID like this entire time. And some people have been fortunate. I was able to get in after waiting about an hour and a half in the freezing cold, get a test before the holidays. I had plans with some friends and I wanted to make sure I wasn't infected. They did the same before we got together. Was able to get a test and the results came back the same day. I was apparently pretty fortunate for that, but at-home tests have been in very short supply, which has been unfortunate because then you can't really make decisions based on that knowledge that you kind of need to have to make informed decisions. So it's good that these tests are going out. It's less ideal that these tests, this particular type, has not been shown to detect Omicron quite as reliably And some people, there's some very, very early research showing that it helps to do a throat swab in addition to a nasal swab, because Omicron tends to tuck away down here, I guess, more than up here, or at least you can detect it better there, something along those lines. That is the current supposition that's not as backed up as we need it to be for them to give actual advice on the matter. But some people in this field are saying, well, you might as well just swab there too. But these tests are not super reliable for the current dominant variant, and they're going to arrive at the end of the month, at which point we will have already crested. And so it will still be useful for a lot of people, but not as useful as it could have been had this happened months ago. So that's the main criticism here right now. Better late than never. And there's a very good chance that, I mean, even if things do get better post-Omicron or after Omicron has hit enough people that there's some even basic immunity even amongst people who don't have vaccinations, which is a good thing for everybody. It'll probably continue in some way, so the tests will still probably be helpful. And apparently they're going to be sending out N95 masks as well, which are very effective masks for this type of pathogen. So that's good too, but those will probably be out quite late as well. So it's a good news, bad news situation. It's good in the sense that things are trending in a good direction in a lot of parts of the world right now. We don't know how good it will be yet. I mean, fingers crossed, good. It would be really nice to be able to go out and socialize more and feel perfectly safe doing it, but we'll see. And good news in that these resources are finally getting out to people who have not had them consistently throughout this entire pandemic, and they seem to be decent versions of the things that they're sending out, at least, which is, again, something they should have been doing this entire time, in my opinion. But bad news in that they are arriving so late. So we'll see if this makes any difference. We'll see if it has if it has any positive results. I mean, I would hope so, especially for the people who catch things late, but it's hard to say. In any case, it's an interesting story in that it's also quite a different approach for the United States, because we don't, in some rare cases we do, but compared to a lot of other countries, we don't get a lot of free stuff. So the fact that this is a free thing that's relatively uncomplicated and we don't have to go through our insurance or anything like that is very unusual. And that speaks to a certain degree of how they've tried other things and it just hasn't worked up to this point. But it also, I think, just says the people up top are getting frustrated at not getting credit for anything, and so they're trying to do something that's hard to argue with. And this, in my opinion, is something that's difficult to argue with. It's good for what it is. It would have been even better if it was 2 or 3 months ago. So that's where we're at today. I do sincerely hope that we see positive results as the Omicron wave subsides. There's a lot of reason to be optimistic about that, but also a lot of reason to still be careful just in case, especially in places, again, like here in the US, but a lot of places around the world right now, throughout Europe. Some of the numbers there are just wild right now. Just hospitals are being strained. And so even if you get a relatively mild version of COVID right now, if you have to go to the hospital at all, it's not a good time to be there because everybody's exhausted. People are being worked to the bone. Resources are being strained. The outcomes are much better with this variant, but it's still not a great time to have to go to the hospital for any reason, but especially for something like this, where there's just so many people heading in for exactly the same thing. Those resources are bound to be strained. But I hope you all are safe out there, wherever you happen to be. I would assume you're at least doing decently well if you're tuning into a live stream. But I do hope that you and yours, everybody you care about, is also good, and that you remain okay throughout the duration of the rest of this. Now, are there any questions coming to the end of this? Those are the 3 stories that I did for today in One Sentence News. And if you're curious about that too, if you want to sign up, the purpose statement for One Sentence News is to provide a succinct trio of stories each day, presented in a way that doesn't flatten or dumb things down, so it still gives you the information you need and puts these things into context, but doing so in a way that doesn't overwhelm you or stress you out. So if something about that seems interesting to you, like it might be valuable, it's free, Go to onesentencenews.com and sign up for it. It's free and it comes out Monday through Friday. It's something I truly enjoy doing because it helps me engage with more things that I otherwise wouldn't engage with. But it's also something that it gives me the excuse to dig deeper into these things, because then I have to figure out what are the most important things? What are the things that I should be communicating, and which things could I leave out conceivably without flattening things to a degree that it ceases to be useful? And which things can I address from a certain angle so that even relatively stressful things aren't stressful and anxiety-inducing? Because in my opinion, even though there's a lot of bad stuff happening in the world, we're in a much better state when we can take this information in and cognate on it without necessarily being hit emotionally by each and every one of these things, the way that unfortunately all too many news sources try to do today. Because our emotions, grabbing people by the emotions is a good way to jerk them around and get them to buy things, which is not something that I'm trying to do here. Please don't buy any one-sentence newses. You can just subscribe for free. Take as many as you want. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'm not seeing any questions here on Twitch, and I'm not seeing any questions here on Instagram either, so I think I might call it a night. If any questions do come to mind, please do feel free to write me. Send me an email, colin@exilelifestyle.com or colin@onesentencenews.com. They all go to the same place. You can send me a direct message on Instagram or on my other social media accounts. Feel free to, anywhere you see me, write me a message and I'll try to get back to you and tell you what I can. I will be doing other Let's Talk About the News sessions like this one. I'll be doing it on Twitch and on Instagram again in the future. I'm not sure when. I'm going to try to change things up a bit. That's something else that, if you wouldn't mind sending me a message, if you have an opinion as to when would be the ideal time for you and your schedule, for your time zone, if you have an idea of when would be optimal for this type of presentation, please do let me know, because I'm looking at a chart anytime I try to schedule these things and just saying, well, when can I hit the most people who could probably understand English the way that I speak it, and who might be interested in this. And I'm definitely missing out on a bunch of people I could be otherwise serving here. So please let me know about that. And I'll probably be doing it on some other platforms as well. My understanding is you can do live streams on Facebook and on YouTube. There's probably some other ones out there too. So if anybody has any experience with those or advice places that you think would be good to see this kind of thing, where you think it might resonate, or where, you know, the topic in question might carry well. I started to use Twitch because it seemed like an interesting place to deliver these things, but I also recognize it's made for people live streaming playing video games. So I'm kind of trying to cram a square block into a round hole with this. If you know of any round holes to go with square blocks, any square holes to go with the square block so that it fits this type of format better, please let me know about that as well. All that said, thank you very much for showing up. It was wonderful having you here. I appreciate you. Thank you for checking it out. I know this is a weird and unusual thing, but thank you for coming out and being such a wonderful audience wherever you happen to be located in the world. I appreciate you. Thank you very much. There. Thank you folks on Twitch as well. I appreciate you.